Okay, so we've looked at time series data. We just did a kind of review of that, and now we're going to look at using recurrent networks, neural networks, to process that time series data. Um, but first, we're going to talk about what we're going to use to kind of compare this to. So let's think back to when we were just doing categorical problems, like trying to identify which of the three iris a thing is, or identifying which of the 10 digits an image was. Um, so in that case, what are we, what's the baseline we're trying to compare this to? Well, one thing you can often say is, well, what if the computer just randomly picked a category and assigned it to that? And so often we want our neural networks to certainly predict better than randomness. And so what does that kind of correspond to here in time series? A common approach is to predict to compare this is if you just predict for tomorrow the same observation you had for today, for example. So, for example, if I told you that at some unknown location, at some unknown day of the week, at noon, the temperature was 76 degrees outside, and I want you to predict what's the temperature tomorrow going to be. And you don't know where this is in the world or what time of year or anything like that. You just know that yesterday it was 76 degrees. So your probably best bet is to say, well, probably 76 degrees to tomorrow if it was 76 degrees today. So this is kind of a naive baseline, is just to predict what it was saying. And for time series, that does amazingly well. So sometimes that's what we're trying to beat, is that sort of prediction for this. Now, let's look at a traditional neural network and how we can approach this process. So in a traditional neural network, um, we want to try to beat that naive set of observations. So rather than just looking at the temperature yesterday, maybe we'll look at the last 5 temperatures. So if you know what the temperature was for the last 5 days, maybe that can give you a better chance at predicting the next day. Or not just 5 days, 10 days, 100 days, I don't know what. So we'll select how many days or how many observations in the past. It might not be days, it might be hourly observations. How many observations in the past we want to look at for this. And so we create what is called a moving window. So if we have a sequence of data, we're going to break this up into parts. So like here we show kind of a moving data. We have this box of 5 of observations, and we move it along. So here we're going to move it forward and look at these observations and try to predict the next one is 33. And then we're going to move it forward here, the next ones, and try to predict the next one would be a 37. So again, we select the first 5 observations and try to predict the sixth. We select the next the observations 2 through 6 and try to predict the seventh. And then we just repeat this throughout the whole time series. We select 5 observations and try to predict the next observation. And so we call this a moving window because, again, the kind of idea is there's this window of observations or boxes that just kind of move along. See my fancy animation I created for this for you to see. And then we're always trying to, again, predict the next one in this line for this. So we will then set up a network, and we'll have the inputs be, like in this case, 5 inputs, and then we'll be predicting one thing, the next input for this. Now, one of the challenges with this is long-term dependencies. How do you know how many observations to look at if you're trying to predict the next element? So if you're looking at words in the sentence, trying to predict the meaning of the sentence or the next sentence, how many words do you look at? You look at 5 words, 10 words, or something like that. Similar for observations. Now, maybe if they're daily observations, you can say, oh, I need 100 days or whatever. But what if they're smaller? What if you have observations that are every minute? How many of those do you need to see larger sequences? And this gets back to how we're kind of processing seasonal data. Remember the seasonal data that is regularly going up. And so if our moving window, oops, sorry, my YouTube processing just finished for my other video. Okay, so if you're looking at a seasonal data and your moving window is only for like a small part of time, you'll generally only see this going up or down a lot. You won't see this overall pattern. So often, if we want to try to process seasonal data, we might want a moving window that is fairly large. So we might be, looking at 1,000 observations the last, if these are daily observations and this is seasonal patterns from winter and stuff, you might want to look at more than 1 year here of data. So there's this problem with traditional networks in this how long-term dependencies and how big of a window do you create for this. So to get around this, we have introduced, researchers have developed a recurrent neural network that kind of maintains an internal state or memory of what has happened before. And then we don't have to feed a whole moving window into these systems. We can feed just one observation at a time, or else just the last few observations to these neural networks. So let's review how a traditional neural network is. I'm going to go back to a previous unit and look at that. So let's look back at, let's go back to unit 7, where we started talking about neural networks. So if you think back to our original neural networks, we started off with 3 layers: an input layer, a hidden layer, and an output layer. And all the connections went in one direction forward to this. So the input layer sent its activations to the hidden layer then sent its activations to the output layer. And so to do that calculation, you may remember when we did these sorts of simulations, when we were trying to do these calculations, we could look at the output. So we would calculate this node here and then that node. We'd calculate all the nodes in the hidden layer based on the inputs from the input layer. And then we calculate the output of the output layer. And then we would do some back propagation, but then we would then redo those outputs again. We would put in new inputs, basically clear out all the hidden and output layers, all the other layers, and then recalculate their activations for this. Because again, everything was feeding forward here, feeding forward. There weren't any connections back here. Now, if you're thinking, you think, oh, I thought we had some complex networks that did that. So let's look back at those. So when we did convolutional networks, we did have some very complicated networks. For example, the inception model, the information fled into this layer here, and then it broke into multiple paths to these convolutional layers or modules, and then that fed forward to these convolutional layers, and that fed forward here. But still notice all the connections are going in one way, or going forward to the network. So all the connections are going here, here, here. So when we're doing our calculations, we can, once we know the activations of this layer, we can calculate activations of this layer, and then once we know that, we can calculate the activations of this layer, and then the activations of this layer there. And there's no connections going back. And you're going, wasn't there a network that did that? There was a network that jumped, the residue network jumped connections, but again, they're always going forward. Sometimes forward is down and up depending on who is drawing these diagrams. But again, these connections are going one direction from the input to the output, and again, there's these connections that go and jump a couple of layers ahead, but again, they're always going here. So again, we can always start a calculation or updates at the inputs and then go layer by layer and calculate all the activations until we get to the outputs. So that is what we call a traditional feed-forward network here that we're working with. Now, what we're going to look at is recurrent networks. So if this is our input layer, two hidden layers, and output layer, we might take our output layer and feed it back and connect it back to the hidden layer. Or we might have to have 2 hidden layers. We might have one hidden layer connect up to another hidden layer, or a layer that connects up to itself for that. So we'd have these sort of connections going back here. And so these are called recurrent neural networks, and we can have these simple recurrent networks. Now, what happens then is, to do the updates, we'd specify some inputs, we'd calculate these activations, we could calculate these activations, and then we calculate these activations. But then the next time through, once we have these activations calculated, if we're doing the recurrent neural networks, we calculate these activations and then these activations. And now when we're doing this, maybe there's recurrent connections. So now to calculate this, you have to look at the inputs or the activations from these nodes that are connected, but also the activations from these nodes that come back and connect here for this. So now we have to remember the outputs here. And so if we're looking at the outputs from one time, the previous activation feeds into calculating the activations for the current activations there. So we have to kind of remember the activations from the previous update in order to use those to calculate the new activations here. So if we're at, we've done a number of updates. We're doing update, for input number 6 here, and then we're calculating these activations for the sixth input. We're also then taking the inputs, the activations from the 5th update, which are still coming back here. So this node is looking at some input from the 6th input, but also the output or the activations from the 5th, the previous output here. So sometimes you'll see a mention of the t as time. So if we're doing update t, we're also looking at data from t-1. So if we're calculating a 6th update, we might be looking at the data or the activations from the 5th update before feeding backwards here. So besides this kind of just connecting one layer back, there are a couple of modern formats for this here, and let me blow these up for us. So long short-term memory networks are this sort of structure here. So let's go over what this kind of structure means here. So what this is trying to show is that long short-term memory networks have two different kind of internal variables. Rather than just keeping track of their activation, which is their output, their internal activation, they also maintain something separate called a cell state here. So they will output two numbers. So these arrows going out of here are their outputs here. So they're outputting an activation, but they're also outputting an internal cell state for this. And so again, that's what we're doing. We have the output value, traditional activation, and this cell state is a secondary value that holds some internal state of the node there. And then we have a series of what we call gates. Gates are another name for just simple circuits here. The first one is a forget gate, and that determines if the cell state of the previous timestamp is forgotten. So how this is kind of done is that what is assumed with this, you see these inputs over here and see how they line up with the outputs. That assumes that we'll put in some new, and this input here is from the previous layer. So some new input will come up here from the previous layer and feed through. You can kind of imagine like current or water flowing in this pipe and going to these locations here, and then that water will flow out here. And what we'll do is we'll hold these values from the previous activation and we'll feed them in here. So this, these inputs over here, this is the previous activation from the last update of this node, and this is the previous cell state here. And so it kind of an idea is that this full flows out of here. It's stored while we're setting up a new input, and then that flows back into the module during the next update as here. That's one way of visualizing this, and that's why these are set up this way. And then like this is the forget state. So if this is our state of the network is kind of the current or the water level along this line here. As new inputs come in here, they'll flow up here, and there will be some calculation, some summing and some calculations here, and then they'll decide if they need to forget this or not. And the idea is that if we have a whole bunch of monotonous inputs here, the network will see the same thing over and over and over again, and so the forget state won't be updating. We'll see the same input again and again and again. So you can imagine just a simple values of the stock market, you see, every minute it's basically the same price, same price, same price. You don't really have to remember that. You kind of say at some steady state here. But at some point, all of a sudden, some news comes out and the price jumps. That's important, and we want to change the internal state. So when the input now changes to some new internal state, that'll push up, and we'll kind of forget our previous state and get a new state, often kind of new internal number that we'll be using to keep track of where we are here. And then we may maintain that, and then later on, as long as the input is this constant amount, and then when the input changes again, we'll may generate a new state here. The other two networks are modules here. We have an input gate and an output gate. So one of them is going to basically take the cell state and combine that with the new inputs here. So this is the input gate. It's going to take the new inputs here and update the cell state. And again, if this has been forgotten or adjusted here, this should update it to a new value. If the inputs are all very consistent, this will keep updating it to the same kind of state here. And then the output state, the output is determined. This is the output here. The output is determined by some of the new input flowing through here, and then the current state here. Going out here. So if we get some new input, that should drive a new output here for this value. And if we don't, if we have the same old input in the same old state, we'll see just the same output again going out again and again. So that's the general layout of long short-term memory. I know it's kind of complicated, but it's just the way it is. Now, they've tried to simplify that some with this gated recurrent network units. So there's an output value. They've kind of combined the output value and the cell state into one node here. So there, you notice there's not two outputs. There's just a single output. So this is kind of the output value of the activation, and it maintains the cell state here. And again, that's loop back. So when we calculate the output for one set of inputs, that output is then used as input, or back into the network or the node when we provide the new inputs into this. And again, we just have a reset and an update gate. And so the reset gate tends to just, if there's new input coming in here, it will try to reset the gate kind of to like the forget gate is. Otherwise, if there's a standard input coming in, this output should remain pretty constant. And then we have a update gate, which again takes the input here and values from the output, the new input and the output from the previous update cycle, and feeds that into something that updates this state for this. And I'm not going to go into too much more complications here. Just know that these are complicated models. If you want to learn more about them, I do have some nice resources here. This illustrated guide to these provides some nice view of this sort of idea for this. And this is a nice video showing this and kind of walking you through. That's where I've got these videos from. But it also has this video. What it's trying to do is kind of show a time sequence here of inputs into these modules and how they're connected. So the idea is that like each frame here might be a different like frame in a movie. So this is one time, this is the next time, next sequence. So, and then these inputs are going into this module one at a time. So this is, we often kind of string these together. So you can almost imagine these as frames in a movie, and you will only see one at a time, but they would create kind of an animation of this one cell. This is just one cell being updated again and again with different inputs over time. So that's what they're trying to show here. And again, they're trying to show that if we have some outputs here, that output is flowing into the next value, the node for the next time update. So that's why these connections are kind of, so they're trying to show this sort of diagram technique here and how things flow through this. So it's not bad. So you can look through that if you want. Now, if you're more interested in the math of this, these two modules go into more the math and the equations. There are relatively simple equations for updating these sort of stuff. So again, this is the forget gate and the input gate there. And again, we're just doing basic matrix multiplication and addition here. So the two main things is matrix multiplication, matrix addition for that. But again, that tends to be beyond the scope of this class for that. But then for us, when we create these networks, we'll just be able to say, give me a layer of LSTM networks. And I need, 40 LSTM nodes, or I need 30 GRU nodes. So just like we were creating simple networks, we'll be able to do these. And now these will tend to be smaller networks, and the updates will be a lot faster. So we won't generally be training for hours like we did in the previous example when we were doing the image processing. So hope you enjoyed this.